Montana Territory, November 1886. While his neighbors rushed to finish single-walled cabins before the first snow, a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller was doing something that made absolutely no sense. He'd already built a perfectly good log cabin, walls 10 inches thick, chinked tight with moss and clay, a solid shake roof overhead. Any reasonable homesteader would have called it done and started stockpiling firewood. Instead, Heinrich picked up his broadaxe and started building a second complete wall around the entire structure. 18 inches outside his finished cabin, he erected another full wall of hewn logs, floor to ceiling, creating a gap that his neighbors couldn't figure out for the life of them. Samuel Bridger, who'd homesteaded in Montana for 12 years, stopped by on a cold afternoon in mid-November and just stared. "Heinrich, what in God's name are you doing?" he asked, watching the German hoist another log into place. "You've got a cabin already. Winter's coming. You should be cutting wood, not wasting good lumber on whatever this is." Bridger wasn't some greenhorn. He'd survived 11 Montana winters, lost 2 fingers to frostbite in '79, and knew exactly how much firewood a man needed to make it through until spring. Heinrich just smiled and kept working. "In the Black Forest, we build different," he said in his thick German accent. He'd tried those first few weeks to explain how his grandfather built in Bavaria, how stone houses back home stayed warm with less wood than these American log cabins burned through. They'd nodded politely and gone right back to doing things the way they'd always done them. Mary Bridger was more direct. She came by a week later and found Heinrich still working on his outer wall. "Mr. Müller, Samuel's worried about you. He says you're using twice the lumber, doing twice the work, and winter's going to catch you unprepared. You've got maybe 2 weeks of good weather left, and your firewood, Heinrich, that's not going to last you past January." Robert Chen, the timber surveyor who'd helped most of the settlement pick their land, rode out from Helena specifically to see what Müller was up to. When he saw Heinrich's double wall construction, he shook his head slowly. "I've seen a lot of building methods, Müller. Some good, some bad, some just plain foolish. This falls into that last category. You're trapping moisture between those walls. Come spring thaw, you're going to have rot that'll compromise the whole structure. And the weight, you're nearly doubling the load on your foundation logs." But Heinrich wasn't just being stubborn. He was methodical, precise, almost scientific in how he built. He'd measured that 18-inch gap with a marked stick, checking it every few feet to keep the spacing exact. Where the walls met the ground, he'd laid flat stones as a base, carefully selected granite pieces fitted together like puzzle pieces, and strangest of all, he'd left the gap between the walls completely open at the top, right under the roof. Thomas O'Reilly, an Irishman who'd built 17 cabins across the territory, declared the whole thing an engineering disaster waiting to happen. He told everyone at Sunday services that Müller was going to freeze to death in his fancy German icebox. "That gap's going to pull heat right out of the cabin. It's like building a chimney around your whole house. Cold air sinks into that space, warm air gets sucked out the top, and you're left shivering while you burn through 4 cords of wood a month." O'Reilly's own cabin stayed comfortable all winter on about 2.5 cords of wood per month. What did Heinrich Müller understand that 12 years of Montana experience hadn't taught Samuel Bridger? What principle of physics had escaped Robert Chen, a man who'd studied building techniques from 3 countries? Before we reveal the scientific genius behind Heinrich's seemingly foolish construction, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. The criticism intensified once Heinrich's cabin was finished. The problem was that his method seemed to violate every rule of frontier construction that had been proven over decades of harsh winters. Building in Montana wasn't guesswork. Men had died figuring out what worked and what didn't. James McCord, who ran the general store in Clearwater 12 miles east, made a special trip out to see Müller's cabin. He walked around Heinrich's structure twice, taking in the double walls, the 18-inch gap, the open top. "Müller, I've been in this territory since 1871. I've seen men try new ideas. Most of them are dead or gone. The ones who survived learned to build the way that works. This is going to fail. And I hope to God you've got enough sense to move in with the Bridgers when it does." The specifics made the criticism even more pointed. A standard Montana cabin in 1886 used logs ranging from 10 to 14 inches in diameter. The logs were notched at the corners, then chinked with clay mixed with grass, sometimes moss. The key was creating a solid, continuous wall that blocked wind and held heat. A well-built single-wall cabin with a good fireplace could maintain livable temperatures even at 20 below zero, as long as you kept feeding the fire. Heinrich's cabin used the same quality logs, the same careful notching, the same tight chinking. But then he'd built that second wall around it. His living space was 16 by 20 feet, standard size. But the overall structure, including both walls, measured roughly 19 by 23 feet. Heinrich had used approximately 60% more logs than a traditional cabin. Elizabeth Hartman, a widow who'd kept her homestead going alone, was more sympathetic, but equally skeptical. "Heinrich's a good man, works hard, minds his business. But this cabin of his worries me. He's alone out there. If that design fails, and I can't see how it won't, he'll be in serious trouble." The settlement's concerns focused on several issues. First was moisture. The gap seemed like a perfect trap for condensation that would cause rot. Second was weight. Heinrich's foundation had to support nearly double the log weight. Third was heat loss. An air gap seemed like it would act as a thermal channel, pulling warmth away. And fourth was efficiency. Why use 60% more lumber when the proven method worked fine? But Heinrich kept working through early December. He spent 3 full days collecting flat rocks from a creek bed 2 miles away. He arranged these rocks inside his cabin, stacking them around the base of his interior walls in a continuous line. The rocks, mostly granite and limestone, stood about 2 feet high and 8 inches deep, forming a thermal band around the perimeter of his living space. Margaret Foster, Samuel Bridger's sister visiting from Illinois, watched this rock hauling with confusion. Is he building a fence inside his house? What possible purpose could that serve? Even Mary couldn't explain it. The rocks took up valuable floor space, added more weight, and served no obvious function. What Heinrich understood, and what his neighbors had never considered, was the principle of thermal mass combined with dead airspace insulation. The physics were straightforward, but they ran counter to frontier intuition about how heat worked. The first principle was thermal mass. Heat doesn't just exist in air, it gets stored in solid materials, and different materials store heat with wildly different efficiency. This storage capacity is measured in BTUs, or British thermal units. Granite, the primary rock Heinrich had collected from that creek bed, has a specific heat capacity of 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That number sounds small, almost negligible. But when you understand the scale of what Heinrich had built, the implications become clear. The roughly 8,000 pounds of granite Heinrich had installed around his cabin's perimeter could store approximately 1,520 BTUs for every single degree of temperature change. When Heinrich's fire heated his cabin from 50 degrees up to 70 degrees, a 20-degree rise, those rocks absorbed and stored over 30,000 BTUs of thermal energy. When he let his fire burn down to coals overnight and the interior temperature wanted to drop, those rocks released that stored heat slowly, gradually, fighting against the temperature decline. It was like having a massive battery of warmth built into the walls themselves. The release rate was the key. Granite doesn't dump its heat all at once. It releases it slowly over hours. While a wooden wall might lose its warmth within an hour of the fire dying down, Heinrich's granite ring continued radiating heat for 6 to 8 hours. This meant his cabin temperature remained stable through the night, even as the fire reduced to embers. Samuel Bridger's conventional cabin relied entirely on wood surfaces and air for heat storage. Wood actually has a better specific heat capacity than granite, about 0.4 BTU per pound per degree, more than double granite's number. But Bridger's cabin walls contained far less mass actually inside the heated living space. His logs were structural elements, part of the barrier between inside and outside. That meant half of each log's thermal mass was exposed to the exterior cold, constantly losing heat to the environment. Heinrich's granite, by contrast, sat entirely inside the heated envelope. Every pound of that mass was absorbing heat from the fire and releasing it back into the living space. The second principle, and the one that seemed most counterintuitive to experienced builders, was dead airspace insulation. Heinrich's 18-inch gap between walls wasn't a thermal channel sucking heat away. It was a massive insulation layer, one of the most effective barriers to heat loss that could be built with frontier technology. Air is actually one of the best insulators known to man, with a thermal conductivity of just 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin. To put that in perspective, air insulates better than wood, better than most solid materials, better than anything the homesteaders were using in their conventional construction. But there's a catch, and it's the catch that made Thomas O'Reilly and every other experienced builder skeptical. The problem with air as insulation is that it moves. When air circulates freely through convection currents, wind pressure, or other movement, it carries heat with it, completely destroying its insulating properties. A gap filled with moving air isn't insulation at all. It's a heat transport system, exactly the chimney effect O'Reilly had described. His concern was logical, grounded in real building physics, and would have been absolutely correct in most circumstances. But Heinrich's design prevented air circulation through three specific, carefully engineered features that his critics had failed to notice or understand. First, the gap was too wide for efficient convection. In narrow air spaces of 1 to 2 inches, like the gaps that sometimes formed accidentally between poorly fitted wallboards, convection currents form very easily. Warm air rises along one surface, cool air sinks along the other, and you get a continuous circulation loop that moves heat from the warm side to the cold side. That's exactly what you don't want. But in an 18-inch gap, something different happens. The outer wall cools in freezing temperatures, creating a zone of very cold, dense air immediately next to it. The inner wall stays warm from the cabin's interior heat, creating a zone of warm, less dense air immediately next to it. Between these two zones, there's a middle band of air that's neither particularly warm nor particularly cold, and crucially, it doesn't circulate efficiently. The temperature gradient across 18 inches is too gradual, too stretched out, to drive strong convection currents. The air just sits there, stratified in layers, barely moving. Second, the gap ran only about 7 feet from floor to top, shorter than O'Reilly had assumed when he'd made his chimney analogy. A taller gap, say 12 or 15 feet, would have created more vertical pressure differential between the cold air at the bottom and any warm air that accumulated at the top. That pressure differential is what drives convection. It's the engine that makes air circulate. But at just 7 feet of height, especially with the viscosity of very cold air increasing as temperatures dropped below zero, the convection currents remained weak and sporadic. There simply wasn't enough vertical distance to build up strong circulation. Third, and this was the detail that really made Heinrich's design work, the walls themselves were hewn logs. Rough, irregular surfaces with bark texture, knots, and natural variations. Unlike smooth milled boards, which would allow air to flow smoothly along their surfaces, these rough logs created constant turbulence. Any air that started to move along the surface encountered obstacles that broke up the flow, creating small eddies and disruptions. It's the same principle that makes a rough road slow down a wagon. The irregularities prevent smooth, efficient movement. Those logs turned Heinrich's air gap into what modern engineers would call a turbulent boundary layer, where organized convection currents couldn't establish themselves because the flow kept getting disrupted and scattered. The net effect was an 18-inch blanket of nearly still air surrounding Heinrich's cabin. This provided an R value of approximately 10 to 12, meaning heat flow through this barrier was 10 to 12 times slower than through solid material. Samuel Bridges' cabin, with solid log walls, had an R value of about 2 to 3. Heinrich's cabin was roughly 4 times better insulated. This principle wasn't new. In Bavaria, stone houses had been built with double walls for centuries. In Korea, the Ondol heating system used similar principles. Plains Indians had understood that a liner inside a teepee, creating an air gap, made the structure dramatically warmer. The Hudson's Bay Company had been building trading posts with double walls in the coldest regions for decades. This was old knowledge that hadn't migrated to this Montana settlement. The critics weren't stupid. Robert Chen was correct that moisture could be a problem, but only in climates with frequent freeze-thaw cycles. Montana's winter air was bone-dry, and Heinrich's open top allowed moisture to escape. The weight concern was valid, which was why Heinrich had spent extra time on his stone foundation. And O'Reilly's convection concern would have been accurate in a poorly designed air gap. Heinrich had also built a small enclosed entry, essentially a tiny room, 4 feet square, between his outer and inner doors. This created an airlock that prevented cold air from rushing directly into the living space. Other homesteaders built simple overhangs, but Heinrich's entry chamber was fully enclosed. It looked like architectural excess. It was actually thermal engineering. By mid-December, Heinrich's cabin sat there looking bulky and odd compared to conventional cabins. His firewood pile was maybe 60% the size of what most families kept. The settlement watched and waited. Winter would be the judge. December 18th, 1886. The temperature at sunrise was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it had warmed to 19 degrees. Nothing unusual for Montana in winter. But then the wind started. Not variable breezes, but a sustained building wind from the northwest that grew steadily stronger as darkness fell. By 8 o'clock, the wind was screaming across the grassland at sustained speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour, and the temperature was dropping fast. -2 degrees at 9 o'clock, -15 at 10, -28 by 11. What had hit Montana territory was a phenomenon that frontier settlers called a blue norther. A massive high-pressure system over northern Canada had collapsed southward, pushing Arctic air across the plains. The combination of extreme cold and high winds created genuinely life-threatening conditions. The storm would last for 4 days. By midnight on December 18th, every cabin in the settlement was in crisis mode. Samuel Bridges' family huddled around their fireplace, which he kept stoked to maximum capacity. He was burning through wood at 3 times his normal rate, feeding logs into the flames every 20 minutes to keep the fire roaring hot. Even with this constant effort, even with flames leaping 2 feet up the chimney and heat radiating from the stone fireback, the temperature inside his cabin dropped steadily, inexorably. His thermometer, hung on the wall farthest from the fireplace, read 41 degrees at midnight. By 1 in the morning, it had fallen to 39. By 2 in the morning, it was down to 38 degrees, just 6 degrees above freezing, inside a home with a roaring fire. The Bridgers piled on every blanket they owned. The children wore their coats indoors, their breath visible in the lamplight. Mary Bridger wrapped hot stones from the fireplace in cloth and placed them in the children's beds. But the stones lost their heat within an hour. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous, creeping into every corner of the cabin, stealing body heat, making fingers clumsy and thinking slow. Thomas O'Reilly's situation was worse. His cabin, built to his expert specifications, maintained with care and pride, simply couldn't keep up with the cold that was pouring in from the north. The wind found every tiny gap in his chinking, every microscopic crack between logs, every imperfection in his construction that had seemed irrelevant in normal winter weather. He could literally feel cold air moving through his cabin like invisible rivers, flowing along the floor, pooling in corners, rising up walls. By 1 in the morning, his 3 children were crying from the cold, despite being wrapped in multiple blankets and huddled near the fire. His wife, Margaret, had chilblains forming on her fingers, painful swelling and inflammation caused by repeated exposure to cold temperatures, even though she'd never set foot outside. Her hands ached with a deep, throbbing pain that only got worse as the night wore on. O'Reilly kept his fire blazing, burning wood so fast that he could actually see his wood pile shrinking. He knew the mathematics, knew he was consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate. If this storm lasted more than 3 days, he'd run through his entire winter supply. If another storm came later, he'd have nothing left. His interior temperature hovered around 34 degrees. barely above freezing, and that was only in the zone immediately around the fireplace. In the corners of the cabin, frost was forming on the interior walls, actual ice crystals on the inside of his home. The moisture from their breath, from the cooking pot, from their bodies, was freezing right there on the logs. Elizabeth Hartman, the widow living alone, was fighting a losing battle against physics and exhaustion. She'd cut her own wood all fall, splitting each log by hand, and she'd done a good job. Her woodpile was respectable for a woman working alone. But she didn't have the physical strength to keep up with the demand this storm was creating. Each log she added to the fire required a trip to her woodpile, located in a small shelter attached to the cabin. Each trip meant opening the door, letting in a blast of Arctic air, losing precious heat. By 3 in the morning on December 19th, she was burning her furniture. A wooden chair went into the fire first. She broke it apart with an axe, feeding the pieces to the flames. Then a small table. She told herself she'd build new furniture in the spring, if she survived to see spring. She was wearing every piece of clothing she owned, including her late husband's heavy coat over her own. Her thermometer read 31 degrees. She was surviving, still conscious, still moving, but just barely. And she had 3 more days of this storm to endure. 3 more days of cold that was trying to kill her. Robert Chen had one of the better cabins in the settlement, built using techniques he'd learned from French-Canadian trappers. Even so, he was struggling. His cabin temperature dropped to 43 degrees, and he was burning wood at a rate that alarmed him. Pastor Wilhelm Schneider, at 58 years old, was experiencing chest pains from the cold stress. His wife was terrified. They kept their cabin at 46 degrees, but Wilhelm was sweating and pale from the effort of maintaining the fire. December 19th dawned at minus 33 degrees, with winds still gusting to 40 miles per hour. Nobody traveled. Everyone focused on survival. The cold was so extreme that water thrown into the air froze before hitting the ground. On December 20th, the temperature had risen slightly to minus 26 degrees, but the wind hadn't eased. Samuel Bridger was facing a hard reality. He'd burned through more than half his woodpile in 36 hours. His wife's hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold. His youngest daughter, Emma, age 4, had developed a fever. That afternoon, Bridger made a decision. He needed to check on Heinrich Müller. The German was living alone, had built that ridiculous cabin, and probably needed help. Bridger bundled up and set out for Heinrich's place, a quarter-mile south. The walk took 20 minutes. Bridger arrived nearly frozen, his face numb, his fingers barely functional. He pushed through Heinrich's outer door and found himself in the small entry chamber. It was still cold, maybe 10 degrees, but the wind had stopped. The noise dropped from a roar to a muffle. He knocked on the inner door. Heinrich opened it, and a wall of warm air hit Samuel Bridger in the face. The German was in shirt sleeves. No coat, no hat, no gloves. Behind him, Bridger could see the cabin. The fire in Heinrich's fireplace was small, not the roaring inferno Bridger had been maintaining, but a modest fire with maybe 3 logs burning. The cabin looked comfortable, normal, like a house on a mild autumn day. "Samuel," Heinrich said, surprised. Come in. You must be freezing." Bridger stumbled inside. The temperature difference was overwhelming. Bridger's thermometer at home read 37 degrees. In Heinrich's cabin, it felt like 70. "How?" Bridger finally managed to say. "How is this possible?" If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and comment below telling me what other traditional building techniques you want me to explore. Heinrich walked to his wall and pointed at a thermometer. It read 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature was minus 26. Inside Heinrich's cabin, it was 64 degrees. That was a 90-degree difference. In Samuel Bridger's cabin, the difference was only 63 degrees, and he was burning wood at 3 times his normal rate. "The rocks," Heinrich explained, gesturing to the granite ring. "They hold heat. The fire warms them during day. They give back heat through night. And the walls, The air between keeps cold outside. The wind cannot steal heat through empty air. Bridger walked around the cabin, touching things, trying to understand. The inner wall was warm to the touch. He opened the door into the entry chamber and felt the temperature drop. He estimated the chamber was around 10 to 15 degrees. He opened the outer door and got hit by the -26-degree wind. Then he closed both doors and came back into the main cabin. Every time Heinrich came or went, the cold air that entered was trapped in the chamber, not in his home. The firewood told another story. Heinrich had a modest stack inside, maybe 20 logs. Bridger had been going through 20 logs in 6 hours. Heinrich's stack looked barely touched. "How often do you add wood?" Bridger asked. "Maybe every 2 hours, sometimes 3. Small fire is enough. The walls keep heat inside. The rocks give heat when fire is low." The math was stark. Bridger was using approximately 80 logs per day. Heinrich was using maybe 25. Over a full Montana winter, 150 days, Bridger would burn about 8 cords of wood. Heinrich would burn about 2.5 cords. If a homesteader's wood supply ran short in February, they could die. Bridger looked at Heinrich with something approaching awe. "I was wrong," he said simply. "We were all wrong. This works. In Bavaria, my grandfather built this way. Stone houses, double walls, very old knowledge. I try to tell people, but English is not so good. Easier to show." Bridger spent an hour warming up. They talked about the construction, about the specific measurements, about how Heinrich had learned these techniques. The German was generous with information, drawing diagrams in the ash of his hearth. When Bridger finally left, he carried knowledge and humility. The storm continued through December 22nd. 4 full days. During that time, the settlement suffered. Pastor Schneider's heart condition worsened. Thomas O'Reilly's daughter developed severe frostbite on her toes, despite never going outside. Elizabeth Hartmann burned through all her furniture and started on her door frames, but word had spread about Heinrich's cabin. On December 21st, despite the continuing storm, Thomas O'Reilly made the same dangerous walk. He found Heinrich in shirt sleeves, comfortable, with his small fire burning. O'Reilly's pride took a hit that day, but his curiosity overcame it. He spent 2 hours asking questions, taking notes. When the storm finally broke on December 23rd, the temperature rose to 5 degrees and the wind dropped. The settlement emerged exhausted, depleted, facing a hard truth. Their traditional methods had barely kept them alive. They'd burned through massive amounts of wood, suffered injuries from the cold, and a quarter-mile away, a German immigrant had weathered the same storm in comfort. The numbers told the story. During the 4-day storm, Samuel Bridger's cabin had averaged 38 degrees internally. He'd burned approximately 320 logs. Heinrich Möller's cabin had averaged 63 degrees throughout. He'd burned approximately 90 logs. Bridger had burned 3.5 times as much wood to maintain a temperature 25 degrees colder. Thomas O'Reilly's cabin had averaged 35 degrees. He'd burned roughly 280 logs and suffered cold injuries in his family. Robert Chen's cabin had performed better, 41-degree average, but still consumed 260 logs. Elizabeth Hartmann's cabin had dropped as low as 29 degrees. The morning of December 24th, Samuel Bridger showed up at Heinrich's cabin with paper and pencil. "I need you to explain this to me exactly. Measurements, techniques, everything. I want to rebuild my cabin this way." Heinrich was gracious. He walked Bridger through every detail. The 18-inch gap, why that width? The open top, why it needed to breathe. The entry chamber, why 4 feet square was optimal. The granite ring, why granite specifically, how much weight per foot of wall. Heinrich even showed Bridger his foundation work. By that afternoon, 6 more families had visited. Thomas O'Reilly came with his notebook. Robert Chen came with apologies and genuine curiosity. Elizabeth Hartmann came with questions about retrofitting existing cabins. James McCord rode out from Clearwater to calculate lumber needs. The data Chen collected was precise. Heinrich's cabin used approximately 180 logs versus 110 for a comparable single-wall cabin. That was an extra 70 logs, roughly half a cord of timber, but the fuel savings over a single winter was 5.5 cords. A homesteader recovered the construction timber by mid-January of the first winter. By end of winter, they were nearly 5 cords ahead. By New Year's Day, 1887, 17 families had been to Heinrich's cabin to learn his technique. He'd explained the principles to all of them, drawn diagrams, offered to help with construction once spring came. There was no gloating, just patient explanation and generous knowledge sharing. Mary Bridger asked Heinrich why he hadn't explained all this before he built. Heinrich's answer was simple. I tried to explain, but my English is not good for building words. And people here, they think their way is only way. They needed to see it work. Now they have seen. Through January and February of 1887, the settlement talked about nothing but Heinrich's cabin. Some families wanted to rebuild completely. Others investigated adding outer walls to existing structures. Still others focused on the thermal mass concept, hauling granite to add rock rings inside their cabins. Thomas O'Reilly, who'd called Heinrich's design an engineering disaster, became one of its strongest advocates. He gave a presentation at the church on January 15th, explaining the principles to 43 homesteaders. O'Reilly had done the mathematics, calculating BTU storage and heat transfer rates. His conclusion: Mueller's design reduces fuel consumption by 62%, while maintaining temperatures 26 degrees higher on average. It's not just better, it's transformational. Robert Chen wrote to contacts in Helena, describing the design. By March, the territorial government had sent a surveyor to document Heinrich's cabin and create standardized plans. Those plans would be distributed to homesteaders throughout Montana Territory, with Heinrich Mueller's name attached as the designer. James McCord's General Store started stocking longer lumber specifically for double-wall construction. He brought in granite blocks from quarries. By spring of 1887, McCord estimated that 43 cabins in the region were being built or modified using Heinrich's principles. Some homesteaders innovated further. Robert Chen suggested that the gap could be even more effective if broken into sections with horizontal dividers. He built his new cabin with cross-bracing every 2 feet, creating 9 separate air chambers. Testing showed this provided minimal additional benefit, maybe 5%, but Chen documented it. Thomas O'Reilly experimented with alternative thermal mass materials. He built a cabin using limestone instead of granite, which has slightly higher specific heat capacity. The practical difference was small but measurable. Elizabeth Hartman couldn't afford to rebuild, but she added an outer wall to just the north side of her cabin, the direction storms typically came from. This partial double wall reduced her fuel consumption by approximately 30%. Pastor Wilhelm Schneider, recovered from his heart episode, gave a sermon in February about humility. We thought our experience made us wise, but experience in one place is not wisdom everywhere. Heinrich Mueller brought knowledge from the Black Forest to Montana, and we called him a fool. The storm showed us who the fools were. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was recorded as one of the coldest in Montana territorial history. But the settlement, now building with Heinrich's principles, weathered the remaining storms far better. Fuel consumption across the settlement dropped by an estimated 58%. Cold weather injuries declined dramatically. Not a single homesteader died from cold-related causes that winter. Heinrich Mueller became something of a celebrity in the territory. He was invited to Helena to present his design. He was asked to consult on public building construction. Newspapers published articles about the German thermal cabin. Heinrich remained modest throughout, always crediting his grandfather and old country traditions. By the end of 1887, over 100 cabins across Montana Territory had been built or modified using double-wall construction. The design spread to Wyoming, to the Dakotas, even to Canada. Modifications and refinements continued, but the underlying principle remained constant. Dead air insulation combined with thermal mass created dramatic heating efficiency improvements. Heinrich Müller died in 1904 at age 62 from pneumonia unrelated to cold exposure. His cabin stood until 1947, when it was demolished for a modern house. But before demolition, the Montana Historical Society documented it thoroughly. Those records remain in their archives today. The cabin's foundation stones, including many of Heinrich's granite pieces, were preserved and are now displayed at the Montana Heritage Center in Helena. A plaque reads, "Foundation stones from the Müller cabin, built 1886, demonstrating thermal mass construction techniques brought from Bavaria." This design reduced heating fuel consumption by approximately 60% and became widely adopted across the territory. Modern building science has validated everything Heinrich understood intuitively. The principle of dead airspace insulation is now fundamental to all construction codes. Standard modern wall construction includes air gaps filled with insulation material, fiberglass, foam, or cellulose, which prevents air circulation while maintaining insulating properties Heinrich used. The thermal mass principle is central to passive solar design and modern sustainable architecture. The American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, ASHRAE, now publishes detailed standards for wall R values and thermal mass applications. Their research confirms that Heinrich's 18-inch air gap provided an R value of approximately 10 to 12, and that his granite ring stored and released heat exactly as he'd claimed. Contemporary building science hasn't discovered new principles. It's quantified and systematized old principles that people like Heinrich's grandfather had understood for generations. The tragedy is how close this knowledge came to being lost. If Heinrich had died in that December blizzard, if he'd given up on his design, if he'd listened to the critics and built a conventional cabin, this entire body of knowledge might have been forgotten. It survived because one stubborn German immigrant believed in what his grandfather had taught him and was willing to demonstrate rather than argue. The broader lesson extends beyond building techniques. Traditional knowledge systems often contain sophisticated solutions to environmental challenges, developed over centuries of observation. But when people migrate, when cultures mix, there's often an assumption that local knowledge is superior simply because it's local. The Montana homesteaders weren't stupid. They were experienced, capable people. But their experience was limited to their methods. They couldn't see beyond what they knew. Heinrich's story is a case study in intellectual humility. The fastest way to stop learning is to believe you already know everything. Samuel Bridger had 12 years of Montana experience. That experience was valuable, but it wasn't complete. Thomas O'Reilly had built 17 cabins. That expertise was real, but it wasn't comprehensive. Robert Chen had studied building techniques from 3 countries. That knowledge was broad, but it wasn't exhaustive. Every one of them had something to learn from a German immigrant with an accent and an unusual building method. The modern world faces similar challenges: traditional ecological knowledge, sustainable farming practices, water management systems, building techniques exist in cultures worldwide. Many are being lost as younger generations adopt standardized modern methods. Sometimes modern methods are better. Sometimes traditional methods are better. Often, the best solution combines both. But we can only find optimal solutions if we approach traditional knowledge with respect and curiosity rather than dismissal and arrogance. Heinrich Müller's double-wall cabin stands as a monument to what happens when we listen across cultural boundaries, when we test rather than assume, and when we let evidence show us what works. The settlement learned, they adopted, they refined, and they survived better because of it. Give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment telling me what other traditional building techniques or frontier innovations you want me to investigate. Next time, we're diving into the story of a Norwegian immigrant in Minnesota who developed a root cellar design that kept vegetables fresh through 9-month winters without any refrigeration. And the scientific principle behind food preservation that shocked agricultural experts in 1893. You won't want to miss it.